It is 1815. The man who has dominated Europe for nearly 2 decades is defeated. He is exiled to a remote island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. He is stripped of power, stripped of his army, stripped of everything he had accumulated. And yet, as he sits on that island, he understands something that no one else quite grasps yet. His defeat is not the end of his influence. His true power is only beginning. Napoleon Bonaparte was born the son of an Italian family in Corsica, an island that had only recently become French. He was small, poor by aristocratic standards, without connections or privilege. He should have remained nobody, a minor military officer in a nation full of minor military officers. Yet through a combination of military genius, political boldness, and an almost supernatural ability to understand what people wanted and what societies needed, he would rise to become the master of Europe. For nearly 2 decades, he would reshape the continent, rewrite the laws, reorganize the borders, and create a legacy that would define European history for the next 2 centuries. But this is not simply a story about military conquest. This is a story about revolution and transformation. Napoleon rose to power during the chaos of the French Revolution. He preserved some of the revolutionary achievements while rolling back others. He created new systems of law, new systems of governance, new ways of organizing society. He spread revolutionary ideas across Europe, even as he conquered it. He showed the world that one man, with sufficient intelligence and will, could bend history to his purposes. Tonight we unravel the life of Napoleon Bonaparte, the boy from Corsica who became the master of Europe, the military genius who won battles that seemed impossible, the revolutionary who preserved the achievements of the French Revolution while transforming them into something new. The man whose final years on a remote island gave him time to reflect on what he had accomplished and what it all meant. How did a boy born into a family without wealth or connections rise to become the ruler of the most powerful nation in the world? What was the secret of his military genius? His ability to win battle after battle against enemies who seemed more powerful. Why did so many people in so many countries believe in him, follow him, trust him to lead them? And what is his legacy? Did he save the achievements of the French Revolution or betray them? Did he advance human progress or set it back? The man who died in exile in 1821 changed the world forever. The legal codes he created remained in place for centuries. The borders he redrew shaped Europe for generations. The ideas he spread about meritocracy, about nationalism, about the possibility of rapid social transformation became central to the 19th and 20th centuries. Every military commander since has studied his campaigns. Every politician has learned from his example. And every person who has believed that one individual can shape history has been influenced, whether they know it or not, by the example of Napoleon. Before we begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps others discover these explorations of history. And let us know in the comments which historical figures you'd like us to explore next. Now settle in as we begin the journey through the life of Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who proved that destiny belongs to those bold enough to seize it, even when all the odds seem arrayed against them. This is the Bedtime Biography of Napoleon Bonaparte. On August 15th, 1769, in the city of Ajaccio on the island of Corsica, a boy was born who would reshape the map of Europe and change the course of history. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. though he would later Frenchify it to Napoleon Bonaparte. He was born into a family of Italian merchants and minor nobility, a family that had arrived in Corsica from Italy and had taken root in the rocky soil of the island. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer and a man of some ambition. His mother, Letizia, was a woman of extraordinary strength and determination who would live to see her son's greatest triumphs and his most terrible defeats. The year of Napoleon's birth was significant. Corsica had been independent for centuries, but in 1768, just a year before Napoleon's birth, the island had been sold to France by the Italian state of Genoa. The Corsican people, who had fought for their independence, who had their own language and their own culture, found themselves suddenly incorporated into the French state. Napoleon's father, like many Corsican notables, saw an opportunity in this new arrangement. He insinuated himself into the favor of the new French authorities. He moved to the court of the French governor. He sought positions and favors for his family. This created a peculiar situation for young Napoleon. He was Corsican by birth, descended from Italian stock, but his father was pushing him to become French, to adopt French ways, to climb the French social hierarchy. The boy grew up speaking both Corsican and French, belonging fully to neither world, always slightly alien wherever he was. This sense of being an outsider, of not quite belonging, marked him from childhood. It drove him to prove himself, to demonstrate that he was worthy of respect, to show that despite his origins, despite his lack of traditional privilege, he possessed something that merited recognition. His education reflected his father's ambitious plans for him. Carlo arranged for young Napoleon to attend military schools in mainland France. At age 9, Napoleon was sent away from his family to attend a military academy in mainland France. The separation was wrenching. He was the only Corsican among French boys. He spoke with an accent. He did not have the wealth or the connections of many of his peers. He was bullied by other students, but he endured. He was determined to prove himself. He studied mathematics and military science with an intensity that impressed his instructors. He was small, and he was often sick, but he possessed a fierce will and an absolute determination to succeed. His fellow students noticed something unusual about him. He was not the most naturally gifted student, but he was the most driven. He seemed to possess an almost supernatural ambition, an absolute conviction that he was destined for something great. Some of his fellow students mocked him for his foreign accent and his poverty. Others recognized that they were in the presence of someone unusual, someone who might actually achieve something remarkable. By the time he graduated from the military academy in 1785, at age 16, Napoleon had transformed himself from a poor Corsican boy into a trained military officer in the French army. He was commissioned as an artillery officer, a relatively new and technical branch of the military that required mathematical knowledge. He was assigned to various posts around France, gradually working his way up the ranks. He was still poor. He still felt like an outsider. But he was now a member of the officer corps of the most powerful military force in Europe. In 1793, the opportunity that would change everything came. The French Revolution had convulsed France. The old social order had been overthrown. The king had been executed. France was at war with almost all of Europe, which saw the revolution as a threat to the established order. The French were desperate for military victories. They needed generals who could win battles. They needed leaders who could command armies and deliver success. At the Siege of Toulon in 1793, a young artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte distinguished himself. Through a combination of bold tactics and military insight, he helped to plan an artillery strategy that broke the siege and captured the fortress from British and Royalist forces. It was a crucial victory at a crucial moment. The government, desperate for military heroes, recognized his achievement. Within a year, he had been promoted to general. Within a few years, he would command entire armies. The boy from Corsica had found his stage. He had discovered that his unusual perspective, his burning ambition, his willingness to take risks, his mathematical mind applied to the problems of warfare. All of these things were valuable in a nation at war, in a nation that was being threatened by enemies on all sides. The revolution had created chaos, but it had also created opportunities for those who could seize them. And Napoleon, with his outsider's perspective and his fierce determination, was ready to seize the opportunity that history had provided. In the years following his promotion to general, Napoleon rapidly became one of the most successful military commanders in France. He was assigned to command armies in different theaters of war. In each case, he achieved success. He seemed to understand warfare in ways that other generals did not. He was willing to take risks that more cautious commanders would not take. He understood how to move armies quickly, how to concentrate forces at the decisive moment, how to break enemy lines through bold maneuvering. But success in war did not automatically translate to success in politics. France in the 1790s was chaotic. The revolution had created a new government, but that government was unstable. There were political factions competing for power. There was economic crisis. There was hunger and poverty. People were desperate for order and for a government that could actually govern effectively. They wanted a strong leader who could restore stability without bringing back the old aristocratic regime. In 1796, Napoleon was given command of the Army of Italy, a relatively small force facing the combined armies of Austria and the Kingdom of Piedmont. The conventional military wisdom suggested that this was an impossible situation. The French were outnumbered. They were facing two enemies at once. But Napoleon had a plan. Instead of fighting both enemies simultaneously, he would drive between them, defeating them separately. The campaign of 1796 was a masterpiece of military strategy and execution. Napoleon moved his army rapidly through the mountains of northern Italy. He defeated the Austrians at the Battle of Lodi. He defeated the Piedmontese, forcing them to make peace with France. He then turned his full attention to the Austrians, pursuing them across Italy and defeating them repeatedly. By the end of the campaign, he had accomplished something that seemed impossible. He had defeated two major European powers with an army that had been smaller than either of them. The victories in Italy made Napoleon a national hero in France. He was celebrated in Paris. The government, recognizing his popularity and his military value, gave him command of the Army of Egypt. The plan was to strike at British power by invading Egypt and threatening British control of the route to India. The campaign of 1798 was less successful than the Italian campaign. Egypt proved more difficult to conquer than Napoleon had anticipated. The British maintained control of the seas, cutting off his army's supply lines. His army was isolated, gradually losing men to disease and combat. But even in the face of this difficulty, Napoleon's political instincts were sharp. He understood that he was losing a war, and he understood that prolonging his presence in Egypt would only make things worse. In 1799, he left Egypt and returned to France. He left behind a smaller force to maintain French control, but he focused his attention on the political situation in France, which was growing more chaotic by the day. When he arrived back in France, he found a nation in crisis. The government was ineffective. There was economic collapse. There were threats from royalists trying to restore the monarchy, and there were threats from radical Republicans. The population was tired of revolution and chaos. They wanted order. They wanted a government that could actually govern. Many of them looked to Napoleon as a potential savior. In November 1799, Napoleon made his move. He organized a coup d'état, a sudden seizure of political power. He marched into the government buildings with soldiers loyal to him. He dissolved the government and established a new regime, which he called the Consulate. He declared himself first consul, the chief executive of the new government. It was a brilliant political maneuver. He presented himself not as a revolutionary, but as a restorer of order, as someone who would preserve the achievements of the revolution while ending the chaos and instability. Most of the population welcomed the seizure of power. They were tired of revolution. They wanted order, and in Napoleon, they saw someone who could provide it. The young general from Corsica had become the leader of France. As first consul, Napoleon faced the challenge of governing France. The nation was exhausted by nearly a decade of revolution and war. The economy was in ruins. The government was bankrupt. There was poverty and hunger. There was also tremendous ideological division between those who wanted to restore the old aristocratic order and those who wanted to push the revolution further. Napoleon's genius was that he found a middle way. He was not interested in restoring the old aristocratic order. He believed in the revolutionary principles of meritocracy, of careers open to talent regardless of birth. But he was also not interested in continuing the chaos and violence of the radical phase of the revolution. He wanted to preserve the achievements of the revolution while creating a stable, orderly government that could actually function effectively. He began by making peace with the Catholic Church. The revolution had been deeply hostile to the church, had seized church property, had executed bishops and priests. This created profound divisions in the population, particularly in rural areas where Catholicism remained strong. Napoleon negotiated a concordat with the Pope in 1801. Under this agreement, the church was allowed to exist in France, but on terms that gave Napoleon control over the appointment of bishops. The Pope accepted that church property that had been seized during the revolution would not be returned. It was a compromise that satisfied neither radicals nor royalists completely, but it allowed the conflict between the revolution and the church to be managed. He also created a new legal code, the Code Napoleon, later called the Napoleonic Code. This was one of his greatest achievements. The code unified French law, which had previously been a chaotic mixture of local customs and regulations. The code established clear, rational principles. It guaranteed equality before the law. It established the right to private property. It established the principles of marriage and inheritance. It applied to all people regardless of their social status or birth. The code was revolutionary in that it established clear, rational legal principles. But it was also conservative in that it established private property and other rights that the radicals of the revolution had sometimes questioned. The Napoleonic Code spread across Europe as Napoleon conquered new territories. It became the foundation for legal systems in many European countries. To this day, legal systems in many European countries and in many countries that were influenced by European law are based on principles established in the Napoleonic Code. Napoleon also reorganized the French government and the French military. He created a rational bureaucracy with positions based on merit rather than on birth or family connections. He reformed the military, making it a professional force that was larger and better organized than any other military in Europe. He invested heavily in military technology and in training. By the early 1800s, the French military was the dominant military force in Europe. By 1804, Napoleon decided to take the next step. He arranged for a plebiscite, a vote by the population, on whether he should become Emperor of France. The vote overwhelmingly approved the change. On December 2, 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor in the Cathedral of Notre-Dame in Paris. It was a symbolic gesture designed to show that Napoleon's power came from the people, not from God or from tradition. He crowned himself rather than having the Pope crown him, signaling that his authority did not depend on the Church. The establishment of the empire was the culmination of Napoleon's rise to power. The boy from Corsica, the outsider who had arrived in France with nothing, had become the Emperor of France. He had done what seemed impossible. He had taken a nation in chaos and given it order and stability. He had preserved the revolutionary principles of meritocracy and equality before the law while establishing a strong, stable government. Once he had consolidated power in France, Napoleon turned his attention outward. He believed that France needed to dominate Europe, not just for territorial gain, but to spread the revolutionary principles that he believed in: meritocracy, rational law, efficient administration. He also believed that if other European powers were not strong enough to challenge France, then France could establish a kind of peace through domination. Between 1804 and 1812, Napoleon fought a series of wars against various European coalitions. The wars of the Napoleonic era were among the largest and most devastating wars in European history. Millions of soldiers were mobilized. Hundreds of thousands died in battle. Entire nations were defeated and forced to accept French dominance. Napoleon's military genius was evident in these campaigns. He understood how to move armies rapidly. He understood how to concentrate superior forces at the crucial moment. He understood how to break enemy lines through bold maneuvering. He seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to understand the terrain, to understand how battles would unfold, to make the right decision at the crucial moment. But more important than his military tactics was his ability to inspire loyalty in his soldiers. His armies marched enormous distances. They fought in terrible conditions. They suffered enormous casualties. Yet they remained loyal to Napoleon. They believed in him. They believed that he could lead them to victory. This combination of military genius and the ability to inspire loyalty made Napoleon nearly unbeatable. One by one, the European powers fell before him. He defeated Austria repeatedly. He defeated Prussia. He defeated Spain. He defeated Russia. By 1812, his empire directly or indirectly controlled most of continental Europe. Only Britain remained unconquered, protected by its naval power and by the English Channel. Napoleon built a coalition of European states under his control or influence, all of them forced to acknowledge French supremacy. Napoleon also reorganized the territories he conquered. He created new kingdoms, which he gave to members of his family. His brother Joseph became king of Spain. His brother Louis became king of Holland. His sister Caroline's husband became king of Naples. He created the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German states that replaced the old Holy Roman Empire. He abolished the Holy Roman Empire itself, which had been the dominant political structure in Central Europe for over 1,000 years. He spread the Napoleonic Code across Europe. He introduced civil law based on rational principles rather than on tradition and custom. He abolished feudalism in the territories he conquered. He established meritocratic systems of government and military organization. He created new systems of education. He reorganized the church and the state. In many ways, Napoleon was spreading the principles of the French Revolution across Europe. The principles of equality before the law, of meritocracy, of rational organization. He was sweeping away the old aristocratic order that had dominated Europe for centuries. He was forcing European societies to modernize, to rationalize, to organize themselves more efficiently. But there was a contradiction at the heart of this project. Napoleon was spreading revolutionary principles, but he was doing so through conquest and domination. He was abolishing aristocratic privilege, but he was establishing himself as an autocratic emperor. He was introducing rational law, but he was doing so under military occupation. Many of the people in the territories he conquered did not experience his rule as liberation. They experienced it as foreign occupation, as the conquest of their homeland by a foreign power. This contradiction would ultimately undermine his empire. Nationalism, which Napoleon himself had helped to create through his reorganization of Europe, would turn against him. People in Spain, in Russia, in Germany, in Italy, began to see themselves as Spanish, Russian, German, Italian, as members of nations that had their own identities and their own rights. They began to resist French rule not as abstract political oppression, but as foreign occupation of their homeland. The turning point came in 1812. Napoleon decided to invade Russia. It was a decision that would ultimately prove catastrophic. Russia was one of the few major European powers that had not been defeated by Napoleon. It remained a potential threat. Napoleon believed that if he could defeat Russia, his dominance over Europe would be complete and unquestionable. The invasion of Russia in 1812 was one of the largest military operations ever undertaken. Napoleon assembled an army of over 600,000 men from France and from the Allied states under his control. They marched into Russia in June 1812. At first, they seemed to be winning. They won battles. They pushed deeper into Russian territory. But the Russians, under the command of the Tsar Alexander Bern and his generals, did not attempt to fight decisive battles. Instead, they retreated, drawing the French army deeper and deeper into the vast Russian interior. As the French army marched deeper into Russia, their supply lines stretched thinner and thinner. The Russian winter began. Temperatures dropped to levels that the French soldiers, many of whom came from milder climates, had never experienced. Men froze to death. Horses died by the thousands. Disease spread through the army. Soldiers deserted. By the time Napoleon reached Moscow in September 1812, his army had been reduced by nearly half. And when he reached Moscow, he found it burning. The Russians had evacuated the city and set it on fire rather than let it serve as winter quarters for the French army. Napoleon found himself in a burned-out city with an army that was weakening by the day, facing a Russian winter that seemed to have no end. He had no choice. He ordered a retreat. The retreat from Russia in the winter of 1812 was a catastrophe. Soldiers froze to death by the thousands. They starved. They were attacked by Russian armies as they retreated. Out of the 600,000 men who had marched into Russia, fewer than 100,000 survived to make it back to France. It was one of the greatest military disasters in European history. The disaster in Russia shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility. The European powers that had been forced into alliance with France now saw an opportunity to throw off French rule. Austria switched sides and joined the coalition against France. Prussia switched sides. Russia was already fighting. Sweden joined the coalition. Only now was there a real possibility of defeating Napoleon. In 1813, the coalition armies faced Napoleon at the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of the Nations. It was one of the largest battles ever fought. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers fought in and around the city of Leipzig. After several days of fighting, the French were defeated. Napoleon was forced to retreat back to France. For the first time, foreign armies were marching on French soil. For the first time, there was a real possibility that Napoleon would lose not just territory, but power itself. In 1814, the coalition armies marched into Paris. Napoleon tried to mount a defense, but it was hopeless. His generals refused to fight. His marshals urged him to surrender. The government of France was asking him to step down. He had no choice. On April 11, 1814, Napoleon signed the deed of abdication. He gave up power. The Bourbons, the old royal family of France, were restored to power in the person of Louis XVI VIII. But the story was not over. Napoleon was exiled to the island of Elba, just off the coast of Italy. He was allowed to keep the title of emperor and to rule Elba, but he was stripped of his power over France and Europe. For a man who had been the master of Europe, exile was a living death. He had time to think. He had time to reflect on what he had accomplished and what had gone wrong, and he had time to plan. In March 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba and returned to France. He gathered soldiers around him. The army, which had been loyal to him during his reign, deserted Louis XVI VIII and rallied to Napoleon. Within weeks, he was back in power, but he knew that the coalition would not accept his return. He knew that he would have to fight again. In June 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo in Belgium, Napoleon faced the British and Prussian armies. The battle was fiercely fought. For a time, it seemed that Napoleon might win, but the Prussians arrived at a crucial moment, and the French were defeated. It was the final battle. After Waterloo, there was no possibility of recovery. Napoleon was captured and exiled again, this time to Saint Helena, a remote island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, thousands of miles from Europe. I'll continue with chapters 6-10, maintaining the same narrative depth, pacing, and bedtime documentary style. On October 15th, 1815, Napoleon arrived at Saint Helena, a small volcanic island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, roughly equidistant from Africa and South America. It was as far from Europe as it was possible to go while remaining on a British possession. The British, determined that Napoleon would never escape again, had chosen the most remote location they could find. They stationed a large garrison on the island. They monitored his every movement. They gave him a residence, but it was essentially a prison. Napoleon was 56 years old when he arrived at Saint Helena. He had been defeated. He had lost everything. He had lost his empire, his power, his freedom. He would never leave the island. He would spend the last 6 years of his life there, increasingly ill, increasingly isolated, surrounded by a small group of loyal followers who had chosen to go into exile with him. But in this isolation, something remarkable happened. Napoleon began to write. He dictated memoirs. He reflected on his life, on his accomplishments, on his failures. He thought about what he had achieved and what it meant. He thought about the revolution, about the principles he had fought for, about how his life and his actions had shaped history. The Napoleon of Saint Helena was a different man from the Napoleon who had conquered Europe. He no longer had power, but he had something else. He had the ability to shape how he would be remembered. He could tell his story. He could explain his actions. He could present himself not as a tyrant or a conqueror, but as a revolutionary figure who had fought against the old aristocratic order, who had spread the principles of the French Revolution across Europe, who had created a more rational and more just system of law and governance. In his memoirs and in his conversations on Saint Helena, Napoleon presented himself as a figure of the revolution, not as its enemy. He said that he had preserved the achievements of the revolution while bringing order and stability. He said that he had introduced rational law and meritocracy across Europe. He said that he had abolished feudalism and the privileges of the old aristocracy. He said that his goal had always been to create a more just and more rational world. Whether this was entirely true is debatable. Napoleon had certainly preserved some revolutionary principles and had spread some revolutionary ideas across Europe. But he had also created an authoritarian empire. He had created a military state devoted to conquest and domination. He had crushed opposition and dissent. He had used violence and oppression to maintain his rule. He was not simply a champion of the revolution. He was a more complicated figure, a man who had embodied both revolutionary and reactionary principles. But what mattered for his legacy was that he had the opportunity to tell his story, to explain himself, to present his version of events to future generations, and in doing so, he managed to shape how he would be remembered. For many people, particularly in France and in much of Europe, Napoleon became a symbol of progress, of modernity, of the possibility of rapid social transformation. They saw him not as a tyrant, but as a great man who had changed the world. As his health declined on Saint Helena, Napoleon seemed to accept his fate with a kind of resignation. He had lived an extraordinary life. He had achieved things that no one else had achieved. He had shaped history. Even in exile, even stripped of power, he understood that his influence would persist. The legal codes he had created would continue to govern societies. The borders he had redrawn would shape Europe for generations. The ideas he had spread would influence the 19th and 20th centuries. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon died on Saint Helena. The official cause of death was stomach cancer, though there have been persistent rumors that he was poisoned by his captors, rumors that have never been definitively proven. He was buried on the island. His body would not be returned to France until 1840, when a new French government decided to honor the fallen emperor by bringing his remains back to Paris. To understand Napoleon's true legacy, we must look beyond the military conquests and the imperial ambition. We must look at what he built that would endure long after his empire had collapsed. And the most important and enduring of these accomplishments was the creation of a rational, unified system of law. Before Napoleon, France was a patchwork of different legal systems. Different regions had different laws. Different social classes had different legal rights. The legal system was based on tradition, custom, and privilege. A nobleman had different legal rights than a commoner. A merchant in one province had different rights than a merchant in another province. The system was chaotic, inefficient, and fundamentally unjust, because it was based on privilege rather than on universal principles. Napoleon understood that a modern state needed a unified legal system based on clear, rational principles. He assembled teams of legal experts and gave them a simple instruction: create a code of laws that will apply to all people, based on rational principles that will govern property, contracts, marriage, inheritance, and all the other aspects of civil life. The result was the Napoleonic Code, completed in 1804. It was revolutionary in its simplicity and its clarity. It established that all people were equal before the law. It established clear rules for property rights, for contracts, for marriage and inheritance. It applied to rich and poor, to nobles and commoners, to men and women equally. It was based on reason and logic, not on tradition or privilege. The code was not perfect. It had limitations, particularly regarding the rights of women, who had fewer legal rights than men. But it was revolutionary in the context of its time. It established the principle that law should be based on clear, rational principles that apply equally to all people. As Napoleon conquered Europe, he introduced the Napoleonic Code in the territories he controlled. After his fall, many of these territories kept the code or based their legal systems on it. To this day, legal systems in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and many other countries are based on principles established in the Napoleonic Code. Even countries that were never directly conquered by Napoleon, but that were influenced by French legal thought, incorporated principles from the Code into their own legal systems. The Code had another important effect. It abolished feudalism and the feudal privileges that had dominated medieval and early modern Europe. It abolished the privileges of the nobility. It established that property could be bought and sold freely without the restrictions that feudal law had imposed. It established that people could choose their own professions and careers, not based on birth, but based on ability. In short, the Napoleonic Code was one of the great achievements of the 19th century. It established the principle that law should be rational, clear, and applied equally to all people. It abolished feudalism and arbitrary privilege. It established the foundation for the modern legal systems that govern much of the world today. This alone would be a remarkable achievement for any leader, but for Napoleon, it was only one part of his legacy. There is a paradox in Napoleon's legacy. He spent his life conquering territories and spreading French rule across Europe. But in doing so, he actually helped to create the very nationalism that would ultimately oppose him, and that would continue to shape European history long after his death. Before Napoleon, the concept of nationalism as we understand it today barely existed. People identified with their local region, or with their religion, or with their social class. They did not really identify with a nation in the modern sense. The idea that a group of people sharing a common language, culture, and history should have their own independent state. This idea was not yet fully developed. But Napoleon's conquests forced this idea to develop. When French armies occupied Germany, or Italy, or Spain, the people in these territories began to think of themselves as German, or Italian, or Spanish. They began to see the French occupation as foreign rule. They began to resist not as local populations or as religious communities, but as members of a nation that had its own identity and its own rights. This nationalist sentiment first expressed itself as opposition to Napoleon. In Spain, there was a prolonged guerrilla war against French occupation. In Germany, there was a nationalist resistance to French rule. After Napoleon's fall, nationalism became one of the defining forces of 19th century Europe. The Congress of Vienna, which attempted to restore the old order after Napoleon's defeat, found itself unable to fully suppress nationalist sentiment. So while Napoleon fought to create a unified Europe under French rule, his actions actually helped to create the conditions for the emergence of modern nationalism. This was ironic because Napoleon himself was in some sense a nationalist. He believed in the greatness of France and in its right to dominate Europe. But his actions unleashed forces that he could not control. Napoleon also helped to create the modern state as an instrument of rational administration and military power. The states he created and reorganized were not based on feudal or traditional principles. They were organized rationally, with efficient bureaucracies, with professional armies, with systematic taxation. They were based on the principle that the state should be organized to maximize its power and efficiency. This model of the modern state spread across Europe. Other states, in order to compete with Napoleon and with the French state he had created, had to modernize themselves along similar lines. They had to create more efficient bureaucracies. They had to professionalize their armies. They had to rationalize their tax systems. In this way, Napoleon's example spread beyond the territories he directly controlled. Napoleon also helped to establish the principle that rapid, large-scale social change is possible. Before Napoleon, most European societies were based on tradition and custom. Change happened slowly, if at all. But Napoleon showed that an entire legal system could be replaced, that an entire government could be reorganized, that the fundamental structure of society could be transformed, all in a relatively short period of time. This idea had enormous consequences. The 19th and 20th centuries were defined by the belief that societies could be rapidly transformed through the will of strong leaders or through revolutionary movements. Napoleon's example showed that such transformation was possible. Whether these transformations were good or bad is debatable. But the possibility itself, the belief that rapid change was possible, came partly from the example of Napoleon. The Napoleonic Wars transformed European society in ways that extended far beyond law and administration. The wars themselves were enormous. They involved hundreds of thousands of soldiers. They lasted for nearly 2 decades. They affected almost every country in Europe. The wars required unprecedented mobilization of national resources. Governments had to raise armies much larger than they had ever raised before. They had to produce weapons and supplies on an enormous scale. They had to organize supply lines stretching across continents. The wars drove innovations in military technology and military organization. They drove innovations in manufacturing and in logistics. The wars also had profound social effects. Millions of men served in the armies. These men came from all social classes. A peasant who had never left his village might find himself marching across Europe, fighting in battles, living in close proximity with men from all social backgrounds. These experiences broke down some of the rigid social hierarchies that had characterized pre-revolutionary European society. The wars also affected the civilian population. Occupied territories had to support the French armies. Taxes were collected. Resources were requisitioned. In some cases, there was violence and brutality. In other cases, the French rule actually improved conditions, bringing rational administration, abolishing feudalism, introducing more efficient systems of law and governance. The experience of occupation was different in different places and different times. The wars also had economic effects. The continental blockade that Napoleon imposed, designed to prevent Britain from trading with Europe, had enormous economic consequences. It disrupted trade. It caused economic hardship in some regions. It created opportunities for smuggling and black markets. It accelerated the development of some industries and retarded the development of others. The wars also had cultural effects. Artists, writers, and musicians throughout Europe were influenced by the Napoleonic era. Some supported Napoleon and saw him as a great man. Others opposed him and saw him as a tyrant. But all of them were influenced by the experience of living through the Napoleonic Wars. The Romantic movement in art and literature, which emerged in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, was partly a reaction to the rationalism and the violence of the Napoleonic era. The wars also had religious effects. The Concordat with the Church that Napoleon negotiated had important consequences. It restored the position of the Church in French society while maintaining state control over church appointments. This model influenced how other European states dealt with the Church in the 19th century. In short, the Napoleonic Wars affected almost every aspect of European society. They drove military, technological, administrative, legal, and cultural change. They accelerated the process of social transformation that had begun with the French Revolution. They created the conditions for the emergence of modern Europe, with its nations, its modern states, its rational systems of administration and law. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Napoleon's legacy is the way that he has been remembered and mythologized. For nearly 2 centuries after his death, Napoleon has been one of the most written about, most discussed, most admired, and most reviled figures in European history. Books about him number in the tens of thousands. Films have been made about him. Plays have been written about him. He has been the subject of endless historical debate and discussion. Part of this enduring fascination comes from the simple fact that his life is an extraordinary story. A poor boy from Corsica who rises to become the emperor of Europe. It is a narrative that captures the imagination. It is a story about ambition, about intelligence, about the possibility of rapid rise from obscurity to the highest positions of power and influence. But there is something more to it than that. Napoleon represents something that continues to fascinate people, the possibility that one man, through intelligence and will, can shape history. In an age of large organizations, of bureaucracies, of systems and structures that seem too large for any individual to influence, Napoleon represents the romantic idea that an exceptional individual can bend history to his will. He did things that seemed impossible. He won battles that should have been lost. He created an empire that seemed permanent but collapsed. He was exiled and then returned to power. He died a prisoner, but shaped how he would be remembered. He is a figure that embodies the idea of human agency and individual will in history. Different groups have claimed Napoleon as their own. Liberals in the 19th century saw him as a champion of rational law and meritocracy, as someone who had fought against aristocratic privilege. Conservatives opposed him as a revolutionary who had destroyed the traditional order. Nationalists in different countries claimed him as a precursor to their own national movements. Military theorists have endlessly studied his campaigns. Psychologists and biographers have attempted to understand his personality and his motivations. The myth of Napoleon has been used to justify different political projects. In the 19th century, Napoleon's nephew, Napoleon III, used the myth of his uncle to come to power in France. Mussolini in Italy tried to present himself as a successor to Napoleon. Other leaders have tried to use Napoleonic imagery and ideas to justify their own ambitions. But beneath all these different interpretations and uses of the Napoleonic myth, there is a core of historical reality. Napoleon did accomplish extraordinary things. He did introduce rational law across much of Europe. He did help to create the modern state. He did spread revolutionary ideas about equality and meritocracy, even as he crushed opposition and dissent. He was both a revolutionary figure and an authoritarian ruler. He was both a liberator and a conqueror. He was both a benefactor of European society and a source of tremendous suffering and destruction. The enduring fascination with Napoleon comes from this complexity. He cannot be simply praised or simply condemned. He was a great man by any reasonable definition, but he was also a man whose ambitions caused enormous suffering. He changed the world, but the changes he brought were not all positive, and they came at a tremendous cost. This combination of greatness and ambition and destructiveness, of revolutionary vision and authoritarian practice, is what continues to fascinate people nearly 2 centuries after his death. I'll continue with chapters 11, 14, bringing the narrative to a powerful conclusion with the same depth and bedtime documentary style. To truly understand Napoleon's impact on history, we must understand why he was so successful as a military commander. How did he win battles that seemed impossible? How did he defeat armies that were larger than his own? How did he accomplish victories that other generals could not achieve? The answer lies partly in his understanding of mathematics and geometry. Napoleon had studied mathematics at military academy, and he never lost his appreciation for the logical, mathematical aspects of warfare. He understood how to use terrain, how to position forces, how to calculate angles of attack and fields of fire. He understood how to concentrate superior force at the crucial point in a battle, even when his overall force was smaller than the enemy's. But more important than mathematical knowledge was his willingness to take risks that other commanders would not take. Military commanders in the 18th century were generally cautious. They followed established procedures and doctrines. They were afraid of losing their armies. Napoleon was willing to risk his armies to achieve victory. He would split his forces and move them rapidly, concentrating them at the decisive moment. This was dangerous. If the enemy discovered what he was doing, the separated forces could be defeated individually. But when it worked, it was devastating. Napoleon also understood the importance of speed and surprise. He would move his armies faster than his enemies expected. He would appear where they did not expect him. He would attack when they thought they were safe. He understood that the element of surprise and the ability to move faster than the enemy could respond gave him an enormous advantage. He also understood the importance of morale and leadership. His soldiers were loyal to him. They believed in him. They would march enormous distances and fight in terrible conditions because they believed that Napoleon could lead them to victory. This loyalty was based partly on Napoleon's military success. Soldiers follow winners. But it was also based on the way that Napoleon treated his soldiers, and the way that he presented himself to them. He was visible on the battlefield. He shared the dangers and hardships of his soldiers. He promoted officers based on merit rather than on birth or connections. His soldiers believed that he cared about them and that he would not waste their lives unnecessarily. Napoleon also understood the importance of supply and logistics. Modern armies cannot move or fight without food, ammunition, and equipment. Many of Napoleon's victories came not from battles, but from his ability to maneuver his army into positions where the enemy's supply lines were cut off, forcing them to either fight under disadvantageous conditions or to retreat. He understood that warfare was not just about fighting battles. It was about controlling territory, controlling supply lines, controlling the movement of armies. Finally, Napoleon understood the importance of intelligence and information. He gathered information about his enemies. He studied their dispositions, their strengths and weaknesses, their likely movements. He used this information to make decisions about how to position his forces and how to attack. He understood that knowledge of the enemy and of the terrain was almost as important as military force itself. All of these elements, mathematical knowledge, willingness to take risks, speed and surprise, leadership and morale, logistics and supply, intelligence and information, combined to make Napoleon a military genius. Other commanders might possess some of these qualities, but Napoleon possessed all of them in abundance. This combination made him nearly unbeatable in direct military competition. But military genius alone could not have sustained his empire. Military victories created the opportunity for empire. But sustaining empire required something more. It required the creation of effective systems of governance, the spread of ideas that could gain the loyalty of conquered populations, the creation of legal and administrative systems that could function effectively. This is where Napoleon's other talents came into play. As we reflect on Napoleon's legacy, we must confront a fundamental contradiction that lies at the heart of his career. Napoleon presented himself as a champion of the French Revolution, as someone who believed in the principles of equality, meritocracy, and rational administration. And in many ways, this was true. He did introduce rational law. He did establish meritocratic systems of government and military organization. He did abolish feudalism and aristocratic privilege in the territories he controlled. But at the same time, Napoleon was an authoritarian ruler who crushed opposition and dissent. He created a vast military state devoted to conquest and domination. He waged wars that killed hundreds of thousands of people. He oppressed peoples in occupied territories. He established himself as an absolute ruler with more power than any European monarch had possessed in centuries. This contradiction between his role as a revolutionary figure spreading revolutionary ideas and his role as an authoritarian conqueror imposing his rule through force is what makes Napoleon such a complex and controversial historical figure. It is impossible to call him simply good or simply evil, simply progressive or simply reactionary. He was a combination of these things. The contradiction also reveals something important about the nature of revolution and social change. The French Revolution had promised to create a world of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But the revolution had also become increasingly violent and authoritarian during the Reign of Terror. Napoleon ended the violence of the terror, but he replaced it with the authoritarianism of military empire. The revolutionary ideal of liberation had been transformed into the imperial practice of domination. This pattern would repeat itself in the 19th and 20th centuries. Revolutionary movements would promise liberation and equality, but would often result in authoritarian regimes. Leaders would present themselves as champions of progress and rational administration, but would use authoritarian methods to impose their vision. The example of Napoleon showed that it was possible to combine revolutionary ideals with authoritarian practice, and this combination would influence many subsequent political movements. The contradiction also reveals something about the nature of large-scale social change. Napoleon's achievements, the introduction of rational law, the abolition of feudalism, the spread of meritocratic principles, these were real achievements that had positive consequences for European society. But they came at a tremendous cost. They were imposed through military conquest and occupation. They were maintained through authoritarian rule and the suppression of opposition. The question of whether the achievements were worth the cost is one that historians and philosophers have debated for 2 centuries, and there is no simple answer. When we reflect on Napoleon's life and career, it is natural to wonder what might have been if things had gone differently. What if he had died at Waterloo instead of surviving to be exiled? What if he had never escaped from Elba and had died in quiet exile? What if the invasion of Russia had succeeded instead of becoming a catastrophic failure? These questions are the subject of endless historical speculation. Some historians argue that if Napoleon had been defeated earlier, Europe would have been spared decades of war and suffering. The lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians would have been saved. The devastation caused by the Napoleonic Wars would never have occurred. But other historians argue that the defeat of Napoleon would have meant the restoration of the old aristocratic order across Europe. The legal codes he introduced would never have been established. The meritocratic principles he spread would not have taken hold. The modernization of European administration and military organization would have proceeded much more slowly. The nationalist movements that emerged in the 19th century might not have developed as they did. We cannot know what would have happened if history had taken a different path. But we can observe that the world that emerged after Napoleon's defeat was shaped by the Napoleonic era. The Congress of Vienna attempted to restore the old order, but it could not fully suppress the forces that Napoleon had unleashed. Nationalism, liberalism, the idea that societies could be rapidly transformed. These ideas persisted despite Napoleon's defeat. In some sense, Napoleon won even though he lost. His empire was defeated, but his ideas persisted. His legal code shaped European law for centuries. His model of the modern state influenced how other countries organized themselves. His example showed that rapid social change was possible, and this idea influenced movements for change throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. This suggests an important historical insight. The impact of a great historical figure cannot be measured simply by whether they achieved their immediate goals. Napoleon failed to create a lasting empire, but he succeeded in changing Europe permanently. He shaped the world that emerged after his defeat. In this sense, his true victory came not during his reign, but in the centuries that followed his fall. We have journeyed from the birth of a poor Corsican boy to the death of an exiled emperor in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. We have seen how this boy rose to become the master of Europe. We have witnessed his extraordinary military victories and his ultimate defeat. We have explored the legal codes he created, the ideas he spread, the societies he transformed, the myths that grew up around him. What can we conclude about Napoleon Bonaparte and his place in history? What is his ultimate legacy? Perhaps the most important conclusion is this: Napoleon demonstrated that one person, through a combination of intelligence, ambition, and will, could shape history on an enormous scale. He was born into poverty and obscurity. He had no natural advantages. He had no family wealth or connections. Yet through his own abilities and his own determination, he rose to a position of power unprecedented in European history. He changed the map of Europe. He created legal codes that remained in place for centuries. He spread ideas that influenced European history for generations. This accomplishment has inspired both admiration and fear. Admirers have seen Napoleon as an example of what an exceptional individual could achieve. Critics have seen him as a cautionary tale about what happens when one person accumulates too much power. Both perspectives contain truth. Napoleon showed that individual agency matters in history, that one exceptional person can shape events on a large scale. But he also showed the dangers of concentrating power in the hands of one person, the suffering that can result when ambition is unchecked. Second, Napoleon demonstrated the power of ideas and systems. His legal codes were more enduring than his military empire. The Napoleonic Code spread across Europe and influenced the development of law for centuries. The model of the modern state that he created, organized rationally, with efficient bureaucracies, with professional armies, and systematic administration, became the model for modern states throughout the world. In this sense, his greatest achievements were not his military victories, but the systems and ideas that he created and spread. Third, Napoleon reveals something important about the relationship between revolution and reaction. He rose to power by promising to preserve the achievements of the French Revolution while ending its violence and chaos. He succeeded in this to a significant degree, but he also transformed the revolutionary ideal of liberation into the authoritarian practice of domination. This pattern, where revolutionary movements are transformed into authoritarian regimes, would repeat itself many times in the 19th and 20th centuries. Fourth, Napoleon's life shows the power of myth and storytelling in shaping historical memory. Napoleon was able to influence how he would be remembered by telling his own story during his exile on Saint Helena. The Napoleon of history is partly the real Napoleon, with his genuine accomplishments and his genuine ambitions. But he is also partly the Napoleon created by his own accounts and by the endless retellings and reinterpretations of his life, by historians, artists, and writers. The ability to shape how one is remembered is itself a form of power that can persist long after political and military power is lost. Finally, Napoleon's life suggests something profound about human history itself. History is not simply the product of large forces and structures. It is also shaped by individuals, by exceptional people who possess the intelligence, the ambition, and the will to change the course of events. At the same time, individuals are not free to do whatever they please. They are constrained by the historical circumstances in which they live, by the resources available to them, by the ideas that are current in their time. Napoleon was able to accomplish what he did partly because he was an exceptional individual, but partly because he lived at a time when the French Revolution had disrupted the old order and created the possibility for a new kind of leadership. The boy from Corsica, who became the Emperor of Europe, died in exile, stripped of his power, unable to influence events directly, and yet he remains one of the most influential figures in European history. His legal codes shaped the development of law across the continent. His model of the modern state influenced how countries organized themselves. His example showed that rapid social change was possible. His life inspired countless books, films, plays, and works of art. In death, his influence extended far beyond what it had been during his lifetime. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of Napoleon's life, that the true impact of a person's life cannot be measured simply by the power they wielded during their lifetime. The most enduring legacies are often the ideas, the systems, the transformations that persist long after the person is gone. Napoleon's empire did not last. His military victories were ultimately reversed. His political power was taken from him. But the legal codes he created, the ideas he spread, the model of the modern state he established, these things endured, and they continue to shape our world, nearly 2 centuries after his death. As we lie here in the darkness thinking about the life of Napoleon Bonaparte, we might reflect on what it means to change the world. It means more than wielding political power. It means creating systems and ideas that can outlast you. It means understanding what your time needs and providing it. It means the willingness to take risks, to do things that have never been done before, to imagine a different world, and then to work to bring that world into being. Napoleon was not a perfect man. He was ambitious, and he was willing to use violence to achieve his goals. He was authoritarian, and he suppressed opposition. But he was also a man of extraordinary intelligence and will. He showed that one person could change the course of history. And the changes he brought, the rational legal systems, the meritocratic principles, the model of the modern state, these changes improved the world in many ways. As you drift off to sleep, think of the boy from Corsica, standing in the ruins of an empire he created, understanding that his true victory was not the empire itself, but the ideas and the systems that would outlast it. Think of how one exceptional person, through intelligence and will, and the courage to imagine something different, can reshape the world. The Napoleonic era has passed into history. The empire is gone. The battles are forgotten. But the legal codes remain. The ideas remain. The model of the modern state remains. And the example of one man's ability to shape history remains, inspiring admiration and caution in equal measure. This has been the bedtime biography of Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who proved that destiny belongs to those bold enough to seize it, the man who showed that one exceptional person can reshape the world, the man whose true victory came not during his lifetime, but in the centuries that followed his death. Sleep well, knowing that history is not simply something that happens to us. It is something that we create through our choices, our actions, and our willingness to imagine a world different from the one we inherited. Napoleon showed us this, and in showing us this, he changed everything. Thank you for spending this time with us exploring the life and legacy of Napoleon Bonaparte. Please like and subscribe for more explorations of the great figures and events that have shaped our world. And let us know in the comments which historical figures you'd like us to explore next. Until next time, rest well